Be the light. Let the flame that burns inside of you change somebody's life. Be the light. That's what I think Jesus was. I don't believe in a resuscitated body. But I do believe that Jesus was a teacher of consciousness. I do believe that he was extraordinary. But I also know that he said the same thing was possible in us as well. It is why he gave teachings like, you are to be the light. You're not to hide your light. You're to be the light. It's why he gave teachings like the greatest commandment is to love, I debated about whether to start this series today or to play it a little bit safer and start it next week. And the reason I say that is because I'm starting with you today a series based on a book that I found a little while ago. It's written by a Quaker minister. His name is Philip Gulley. He has fallen in and out of favor with the Quaker faith, which makes me like him all the more. And when I tell you the title of the book, you'll know why. If the Church Were Christian. I even asked one of my friends, Art Stillwell, do you think it's safe for me to start a series based on the title of this book, If the Church Were Christian, on Easter Sunday morning? He gave me a little bit of encouragement. And the reason I say that is because, Easter comes with so much baggage for so many people. So many people who find their way into unity really did come from some Christian faith. And usually people find their way into unity because they found that they could no longer agree with maybe some of the doctrines of the church or the beliefs of the church or the expectations of the church or some of the myths and stories that they were being told they needed to take as historical fact. And yet we come in on Easter Sunday morning sometimes carrying a bunch of baggage or carrying a lot of things that we've never really examined to ask, are they true? Is this valid? Does this make sense to my mind and my heart and my soul? This book and this series is going to be an exploration of the idea, if the church were Christian, we're going to be looking at the values that Jesus stood for. Something had to have happened, right? That we still talk about him today. Something had to have happened in the life of his followers that caused them to reorient their lives, to rethink, to rework, to try to share and speak about what it was that they thought he was teaching. He was teaching about a different kind of relationship with spirit, a different way of being in the world, a different way of caring about the world. So the first idea that we want to explore that comes from Philip Gulley's book is this. If the church were Christian, Jesus would be a model for living rather than an object of worship. Isn't that just that sentence alone? We could just take that and go, okay, I've got some work cut out for me, right? Jesus would be a model for living rather than an object of worship. It's so much easier to worship than it is to be a follower and to really try to understand the teachings and to practice them in our lives. Worship is easier. Think about mega churches that are built on so much production and so much music, praise music that gets people all pumped up, right? There's an energy and it may feel good, but that's not the same thing as really understanding what the teachings are and practicing those teachings. It's much easier to be a fan than it is to be a follower. Jimmer, I remember when you first gave me this quote, and it's one of my favorite quotes. It's from John Fugelsang. He's an actor, comedian, writer, TV host. He said, "I've come to view Jesus much the way I view Elvis. I love the guy, but the fan clubs really freak me out." Can I have an amen to that? And man, the fan clubs today, I don't know about you, but I'm a little afraid of some of them. I mean, all joking aside, the rise of Christian nationalism is something to be concerned about. That's the hijacking of Jesus' teachings. That's not what Jesus taught. It's scary to think how many people believe that, though, that believe it. And, the truth is we really can't know for certain exactly what he taught. We really can't know. Why? Why do I say that? And yet there are those who swear by the literal word of the Bible, the literal word of everything in the Gospels. And I wonder, did you ever read them? And if you did read them, did you read them with critical thinking, the kind of thinking that we were taught to use in high school and certainly taught to use in college? Critical thinking skills. Here are just a few of the reasons that we can't know for certain exactly what happened or exactly what he said. There's a significant time lapse from the crucifixion to the very first writing of the first gospel, the oldest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, which wasn't written down for 70 some years afterwards. How good is your memory? Enough said. We can't know for certain because there are numerous gospels and writings attributed to Jesus or about Jesus that aren't in our Bible. Did you know that? Some of you know that, but not all of you know that. The Bible itself was canonized over a period of several hundred years. Some Gospels got in, some didn't. Human beings with their own understanding of the writings and interpretations and perhaps their own audience that they were trying to convert or convince, determined which ones would get in. Does that leave you any margin of concern? Is it a point of pause to say, okay, wait a minute, I need to keep some of this maybe in perspective? And then if you take the Gospels that we do have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you read them critically, they don't all agree. That very important piece that I shared with you from Bishop Spong. In the Gospel of Mark, you don't have the risen Jesus. That's what Easter's supposed to be about. Don't you think that's kind of an important thing for somebody to have forgotten to put in? I mean, really? Don't you? So what's going on here? A litmus test for me when I read the Gospels. Here's my litmus test. What teachings, ideas, values don't seem to be coming from an ulterior motive to create or prop up an institution or attempt to control a group of people? That's one. What teachings, ideas, values, actions are attributed to Jesus that don't require me to leave my thinking mind out of the picture? What teachings, ideas, values, ideas would help me be a better person? And what teachings, ideas, values did Jesus express that seem to be universal? So when I read a story, or when I read, this is what Jesus said, this is the litmus test I go through, because I think he was a teacher of consciousness. I think he was extraordinary in that. But I don't look at him the way a fundamentalist looks at him. I think he would want us to bring a critical mind to trying to understand what the concepts and the ideas and the difficulty to practice what he was talking about. Have you ever tried to go through a day without judging? Have you ever tried to love unconditionally? Then you know This is advanced stuff that he was teaching. I'm reminded and I'm blessed to have a previous Lutheran minister at a church that I was confirmed in here in San Diego, Reverend Laurel Gray here. Laurel used to be connected with the Jesus Seminar, and I was thinking about that as I was putting together this message, and as I was thinking about my own litmus test for Jesus' teachings. The Jesus Seminar was popular in the 1980s and 1990s, and it was an attempt, I think, largely of clergy and some Bible scholars coming together, trying to read what we have attributed to Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the words of Jesus, and to vote on those sayings that this group, this esteemed group, truly thought would have come out of the mouth of Jesus. And so they would give they voted with stones or something. They would give a red stone if they thought this particular saying really came from Jesus. They would give a white stone if they thought, maybe, maybe not. Maybe it was attributed or just plopped in there because it sounded good. And then a white or a gray stone to those that they said, no way, we don't think he would have said it. And the reason I think they picked the red and the pink and the white or the gray was, how many of you remember getting like a King James version of the Bible, the red letter edition, right? Do you remember those? Some of you remember those? You'd open them up, and the red letters, the red type, these were supposed to be the words of Jesus, right? And so this group really tried to have their own litmus test to be able to say, what do we think this teacher of consciousness, stripped of things miracles that just are not believable for anybody with a rational mind, to be able to say, but yet, what did he say and teach and invite us to do and be that could help all of us be better people individually and better people in the human family? The object of worship idea over the model of living idea actually rests more on doctrinal beliefs about Jesus than on his teachings, more about churchianity than Christianity. I even hesitate to use the word Christian or Christianity anymore because of the rise of Christian nationalism. I prefer what the first, quote, Christians were called. They weren't called Christians. Do you remember what they were called? Some of you do. Followers of the way. That's a verb. Christian is a noun. A verb implies what? Remember from school? A verb implies what? Action, followers of the way. Built more on church teaching, church doctrine, his divine origins. Did you know that that's not unique to Jesus? There are other divine origin stories of other teachers and gods and myths and so forth. His moral perfection. I don't want a Jesus that was morally perfect. That's out of reach for me to be able to be inspired by. He struggled as you and I did. When he went into the temple to overthrow the money changers, he didn't go in with this enlightened consciousness in my mind. He was angry. He threw them out. He turned the tables over. I wouldn't want you doing that in here. It wouldn't be a sign to me of your highly evolved spiritual maturity. When he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was really human. I believe that there's a kernel of history in that experience. I believe he sensed a very tragic end, and that he was in the garden and he was praying. He was a good Jew, a radical Jew, but a good Jew, a monotheistic Jew. And I think he was in that garden knowing something was going to happen, something terrible was going to happen. He asked his buddies, the disciples, come and stay with me, pray with me, and they fell asleep. Really human. You've had friends like that, I'm sure. And in the garden, he prayed in anguish, we're told. Let this that's about to happen to me pass. Pass. Isn't that very human? Can you relate to that? Can you relate to a Jesus that cried? Can you relate to a Jesus that needed time alone? Can you relate to a Jesus that struggled with his disciples who were kind of quabbling among themselves who was going to be his favorite and his chosen one? Can you relate to a Jesus that cried tears? Can you relate to a Jesus that also rose to the occasion and talked about loving and forgiving and serving and being with, quote, the marginalized, the least of these? Can you relate to a full spectrum Jesus better than you can to a morally perfect, without flaw? You're very quiet. That's okay, I'm talking to myself and I'm having a nice time. Some of you might write me, I hate letters, but you know what? At my age now, I don't care anymore. I guess I don't. The moral perfection of Jesus is a keystone of Christian orthodoxy, but it's important to remember he didn't claim it for himself. He didn't. He said, what I do, how I be, I'm adding that part, you can do as well. That's a really powerful invitation, a really powerful invitation. It's in some ways very much like the Buddha, knowing that each of us has that same nature within. Each of us has that same nature within. Here are some powerful words from Gulley from the book. He says, I argue against the deification of Jesus because of my admiration for him. I argue against the deification of Jesus because of my admiration for him. I believe his promotion to divine stature contradicts the Jewish faith of Jesus and ultimately encourages behavior inconsistent with the ethic of Jesus. It has made the church overly proud and prone to asserting itself as the only path to God. In questioning this claim, my wish is not to diminish the life of Jesus, but to honor it as fully as I can by asking whether his elevation to divinity is something he would have wanted. When he was approached by a man who called him good teacher, he responded, why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. And then Jesus directed the man to a style of living he believed would honor God and God's priorities. In unity, we look at Jesus and we say, he was not the great exception. He was a great example. Not the great exception, a great example. That the same spark of divinity that was the flame that burned bright in his heart, that same spark of divinity resides in every single one of us. And we didn't put it there. We didn't put it there. We can't get rid of it. We can hide it. We can put a lot of stuff over it, but it's still there. And it's there not because we're sitting in the right church or we're not sitting in any church at all. It's there regardless of our sexual orientation. It's there regardless of our political persuasion, our education, any other label we can put on it. None of those labels takes that away or out of us. But it is up to us to acknowledge it. And I think that's what his life was about. I think that's what he discovered. That's why he tried to breathe new life into his Jewish religion, his faith, and then to share that boldly with as many as he could, to help as many as he could to follow in a similar path, not to put him on a pedestal and worship him as someone or something out of reach. Have you ever heard the term believer as it's used in Christian faith? Some time ago, I was buying a piece of used furniture I had found on Craigslist. And I went over to the person's house to pick up the piece of furniture. And as I almost always do, I had my Unity pendant on. And when she saw my pendant, she was very curious about it. Lovely woman, bought quite a few things from her, but she saw the pendant, the first time she saw the pendant. She asked me about it, and she asked me, where does it come from? What does it mean? And I explained I was a minister and something about, as best I could, about unity. And she looked at me, she said, "Oh, I don't go to church, but I'm a believer." And I thought to myself, it's so easy to believe something, right? And I don't mean her any ill will, but that's an easy thing to say, I believe. I don't think Jesus would be very impressed with that. I don't think the Buddha would be very impressed with that. I don't think any teacher of consciousness would be impressed with that. What I think they would be impressed with is, and what are you doing? How are you living? How are you healing your own life so that you can also be a source of inspiration to others? Because every win you have in your life, every personal wound you heal, every fear you push beyond, every demonstration of faith, every act of giving and serving and forgiving, there is someone, and maybe many someones, that are at least catching a glimpse of that. And whether you know it or not, whether you ever hear about it or not, the way you choose to live, the way you choose to move through your life experiences has an impact on other people. And you may be the very light that they see that inspires them. Whoa, if she could do it, if he could do it, if they could live that way, if they could move through that fear, through that doubt, through that hurt, through that anger, if they could include the marginalized, if they could be like that, then maybe I can as well. I want to close with a few final ideas. To live in more of the way that I think Jesus, and for that matter, the Buddha and other teachers taught, would actually result in some very significant personal and social changes, perhaps more than we're really, truly, fully ready to embrace, but maybe we can at least take a step in the direction. Because if we think about who Jesus stood with, who Jesus tried to protect, who Jesus served, who he challenged, who he questioned, we would see that it is something for us to stretch into. It's not for the faint of heart, but it is within every one of us. It is within the grasp of every one of us. I want to close with these words first from Reverend Lynn Unger, and then a few words from Gulley again. Reverend Lynn writes, "For me, the Easter story is about how Jesus transformed from a man who walked and ate and talked with people into something that couldn't be killed, a set of ideas about how we should treat all people with love and respect, how we should care for those who are poor or hurting, giving kindness when we want to take revenge, and love our neighbors as we love ourselves, even if our neighbors don't look or sound or act the way we think they should. The man who taught these things was transformed into the teachings themselves, something that his companions could take out into the world to share." And then closing with Gulley's words, "The Christian gospel ought not be that Jesus was God and we can find life in his death. Our good news is that we can find life in his example, accepting the excluded, healing the sick, strengthening the weak, loving the despised, and challenging the powerful to use their influence redemptively. These objectives do not require divinity, but commitment, compassion, and courage. Jesus accomplished what he did not because of some supernatural power unavailable to the rest of us. He accomplished what he did because of his steadfast dedication to the priorities of God." Namaste.